Hello. In this screencast, we're going to be taking a look at the end of World War I, starting with the armistice and following through the process that ended with the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that some people link to the beginning of World War II. Got a lot to unpack here, so here we go. The war itself, as far as the shooting, stopped in November of 1918, several months after the United States had brought thousands and thousands of fresh troops and supplies to the Allied side. Faced with those odds, the German government ended up with the Kaiser abdicating and the new government surrendering in November of 1918, 11 a.m. on the 11th month and the 11th day. Kind of quirky there, isn't it? The armistice was simply a ceasefire. It did not set any official surrender terms. It didn't provide for any post-war agreements or terms whatsoever. All it did was stop the shooting. Therefore, the Paris Peace Conference was held throughout mostly 1919 with an eye towards accomplishing two things. First, to create a final peace agreement among the parties, and secondly, hopefully to make the Great War the war that ended all future wars. Ideally, if this process had worked, there never would have been a World War II. We know obviously what happened. Now we're going to look back at why. Before we do, take a look at this graphic, which is in chapter 14, section 4 of your text. It's actually a very neat little graphic that describes the ending costs of World War I. If you check out up here in the corner, you can see that Germany spent tremendous amounts of money for the war, as did France and the British Empire as well. Russia doesn't spend as much, but remember they had fewer resources and dropped out after 3 years. Austria didn't have a lot of resources to begin with. The United States spent a good chunk, but was only in it for the last year. So the money aspect of Britain and Germany may come into play later. If you look at the casualty charts, again, the setup by way of pie charts indicates, for example, the green percentages are those soldiers who were mobilized and ended up not being casualties, not being killed, wounded, or captured. If you look at the Central Powers, you'll notice that when you add it up, 64% of German soldiers and a whopping 89% of Austrian soldiers ended up as casualties during the war. The British fared a little better with 35% casualties, the French 73% casualties, the Russians 76%, and the United States, being in it for the shortest period of time, was fortunate in about 8% casualties. Those numbers are all going to come into play during the treaty negotiations, as you're going to see in a little bit. So who's at this conference? Specifically, we're looking at the big four, nations and individuals. One thing that's remarkable about this conference is that the leaders themselves took an active role in the negotiations. Probably the most significant player at the conference was our own President Woodrow Wilson. We've mentioned him before, formerly president of Princeton University, brilliant individual, one of the smartest people ever to hold the office of president. And yet he was somehow convinced of this. And he did come into the conference with a plan to guarantee peace and freedom for democracy. We'll see how that plays out. Wilson's going to be set off for a lot of the conference against this man. This is Georges Clemenceau, Premier of France. Older gentleman, obviously. Looks like a walrus, but was nicknamed the Tiger. Clemenceau had been around a long, long time when the conference happened. He had actually been part of the French government when the Germans had taken away the coal and iron fields of Alsace-Lorraine back in 1871. Clemenceau has a long memory and won't forget this one soon. Listen for that as well. Next to them, David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Great Britain. As we saw in the infographic in the last slide, Lloyd George knew that Britain had spent an awful lot of money during the war. And as part of the final peace settlement, not only did he want Germany not to be able to wage war in the future, but he was also interested in getting some reparations, getting some economic compensation for Britain's losses. The fourth member of the Big Four was Vittorio Orlando, Prime Minister of Italy. You might remember from our bar fight exercise that Italy had started the war lined up with the Central Powers, but in 1915 surprised everybody by turning around, punching Austria, and taking some land away from them. Orlando assumed that he was going to be able to keep all that land that was taken in the war, and he was there to make sure that that was carried through in the final treaty. So to recap, Wilson basically wants to reconcile everybody. Clemenceau is interested in revenge, Lloyd George in reparations, and Orlando in real estate. A lot of conflicting interests and conflicting values there. There are some countries that aren't there. For example, the Russians. The Tsar had been taken over by the Bolshevik Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, which will be a big part of our next unit on totalitarian states. For now, the key takeaway is that Russia dropped out after turning communist in 1917. Who is there and can't discuss or vote on things? The Central Powers. Remember, when they signed off on the armistice in November of 1918, they effectively surrendered unconditionally. Technically, they were labeling themselves the losers and putting themselves at the mercy of whatever the Big Four put together. Obviously, they're hoping for a little bit of peace and a lot of forgiveness. Two different approaches. Wilson's approach was referred to often as peace without victory. His idea was that if there were no winners or no losers in the treaty, nobody would have a reason for revenge or nobody would have a grudge to fight for. Therefore, that would prevent conflicts in the future. By taking away the need for revenge, no winners, no losers, no grudges. That's his thought. Clemenceau and Lloyd George took on a different approach. You might remember they had been involved in the war for all 4 years, as opposed to the US, who had only come in the last year, or even less when you count the actual mobilization. Clemenceau's France had suffered 73% casualties. Next to Germany, Great Britain's pockets had been emptied the most in money terms. So their policy could be summed up as revanche. They wanted to punish Germany and Austria with the idea that strict punishments, whether monetarily or land grabs, would basically keep Germany and Austria in a position of not being able to wage war, and therefore no conflicts that way. We'll see which one plays out. Wilson, as we stated earlier, had come to the conference with a peace plan already written up. It's referred to as the 14 points. We're not going to ask you to be familiar with all 14 points here, but it would help to be aware of 3 main ideas contained within the 14 points. The first one, which constitutes points 1 through 5, is to eliminate the causes and reasons to go to war. For example, eliminate the secret treaties that brought in countries through the alliance system. Open up trade, make the seas available to everybody to do business. Limit military buildup. This one is probably the most significant of the first 5 points, in that if you take away the guns, the thinking is you don't necessarily go to war. The second theme, which is covered in points 6 through 13, which are much more individualized. Self-determination for Eastern Europe. If you look at a map of Europe in 1914, you may notice empires like the Ottoman, the Russian, and especially the Austrian that were made up of what we'd called stateless nations. People that had language, culture, history, but no self-government. In Wilson's view, peace could be maintained if those states, those stateless nations, were allowed to become states and decide their own future. The 14th point probably should be starred, emphasized, highlighted, whatever you do to bring attention to it, because this, the last point, is the centerpiece of Wilson's plan. He wants a League of Nations. He wants a world assembly where countries can get together, solve their problems peacefully, and head off any future war. It's an incredibly ambitious plan, and Wilson expects that all of it's going to go through. Unfortunately, that doesn't turn out to be the case. As you see here in this illustration, the other three leaders tended to line up against Wilson. Over here you see Lloyd George, Orlando, Clemenceau, and digitally separated from the bunch is Wilson. Lloyd George in particular was kind of caught up in between the arguments between Clemenceau and Wilson, who were really the two most at odds during this whole process. Lloyd George likened it to sitting between Jesus Christ and Napoleon while the negotiations were going on. Clemenceau himself was heard to say of Wilson once, and I'll do a very bad accent here, 10 commandments were good enough for God, but Wilson has to have 14. So Clemenceau obviously didn't think much of Wilson's plan either. So what does the final treaty look like? Well, there are a lot of actions taken with regard to Germany. First, Article 231 may be the most famous section of the treaty, known as the War Guilt Clause. In it, Germany accepts full responsibility for the war. Remember, the actual conflict starts as a scrap between Austria and Serbia. And yet, because of Germany's military buildup and support of Austria in that conflict, they end up catching all the heat for the war. And as such, they agree to pay all reparations or war debts, in effect signing off on a blank check. Over time, this bill is going to run into the billions and billions of dollars, leading to problems for Germany down the road, problems for which they're going to find some pretty rough solutions. Third, Alsace and Lorraine. Shown here in the pink, the territories loaded with coal and iron revert back to French possession. So a lot of Germany's industrial base is damaged by this clause of the treaty, which makes it harder for them to rebuild. Fourth, Germany loses all of its overseas colonies, which either revert to control by the British or French, or they are turned into mandates, something we're going to get into in a moment. And fifth, the German army is limited to 100,000 troops, roughly 10% of its pre-war strength. Their navy and air force are effectively dismantled. So as you can see, Wilson's idea of peace without victory isn't exactly being carried out here. The order of the day is more revanche. Clemenceau and Lloyd George are laying some pretty heavy stuff on Germany. Now, why is Wilson willing to let a lot of this go as far as Germany is concerned? Well, if you look at the rest of the treaty, it does create a lot of new independent states in Eastern Europe. If you look at this section here, you'll notice that Austria and Hungary are basically broken up into separate states. Austria here, Hungary here. The Czechs and Slovak people are combined into the new state of Czechoslovakia. Poland becomes independent. The Balkan states, like Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, etc., are brought together in what's supposed to be a collective, what are called mandate. The mandate was basically an artificial state created by somebody else, in this case, the Allies. The assumption is going to be that because these states are too small by themselves to protect themselves, by combining them into a single state, they'll be better able to protect one another. Unfortunately, in the case of Yugoslavia, and we can't see it on the map here, but Iraq, you were taking people that had been traditional enemies and you were essentially forcing them together with the idea that they would all make up and make nice and be a single nation. As we're going to see in later units, that doesn't necessarily happen. So what else is Wilson going to get that would make up for all of these other sections? He does get the League of Nations, the thing that he wants the most. So how's it all going to work out? Well, we know that the war to end all wars wasn't that. How does the Treaty of Versailles play into the idea of a Second World War? Here's some possibilities. First, it generates that German desire for revenge. In this treaty, they are clearly designated as the losers, from the war guilt clause to reparations to losing colonies and military strength. It does create a German desire for revenge. It cripples the German economy, and because it's seen as a failed treaty, it makes extreme political views more popular, not just in Germany, but in a lot of other places. Communist and fascist movements, and that includes Nazism, are going to get a big boost by promising people that they're going to go against or abolish what's in the Treaty of Versailles. Fourth, the League of Nations is an issue. The League of Nations is a nice idea, but it wasn't given much enforcement power. It could tell countries they were doing wrong, but it didn't do much to stop them from doing anything wrong. It also suffered by not having a complete membership. When the League begins, Russia is not invited to join, neither is Germany. The United States, ironically enough, chooses not to join. Wilson brings the treaty home for approval by the US Senate, as laid out in the Constitution. Many senators and many Americans at that time had been happy to get into the war to make it safe for democracy, but once it's over, a lot of Americans wanted to revert back to being isolationist, and therefore didn't support the idea of committing to a League of Nations that would have brought them into other nations' conflicts. So sadly for Wilson, the thing he wants most out of his 14 points in this Treaty of Versailles is something that the United States at that time wanted no part of. Wilson ends up going on a barnstorming tour to try to drum up public support for the treaty. During that tour, he suffers a massive stroke and ends his presidency basically a bedridden invalid, never seeing his dream come to full fruition. He'll die in 1924, not too long after the final treaty comes out. And in that treaty, before his death, rather, he makes two final predictions. One, within a generation, and remember he's speaking in 1924, there would be a Second World War. Accurate? Second, he predicted that the weapons of the Second War would make those of the first look like children's toys. And when his baseline is long-range artillery, poison gas, aerial bombing, and the Maxim machine gun, to make this prediction was pretty bold, but as we're sadly going to find out, all too accurate. That basically wraps us up as far as the Treaty of Versailles and our unit on World War I. We'll probably refer back to this in future units, so this is a very important concept and we hope you hold on to it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.